Okay, so we're now going to take a little break and build something fairly cool. It's this little profile image type thing, and when we actually hover over it, you can see that the color gradually changes to it goes from grayscale to color very gradually. Now, all of this is done with one image, and it's done with transitions, and it's done with filters as well, CSS filters. So as well as learning a couple of other properties, we'll look at how we can utilize the hover pseudo class to actually change this when the user hovers over it. And of course here we've got a nice border radius, which we've already looked at just to make it a little bit friendlier. So this is the code that we're going to be building. Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we're going to start off with the markup. We need to think carefully about how we want to structure this. We could obviously just have an image in there, and then we could target that particular image, and that would work. But what I want to do is I want to wrap this in a container that specifically says this is a profile. And the reason I want to do that is because if later on I wanted to say add a username to this image underneath, it would be better that the whole thing is wrapped in some kind of modular structure. And that is because then we can say something like, well, I want to style the anchor within that profile element. So if this doesn't make too much sense, we'll look at this now. So we're going to create a div with a class, and that class is going to be profile. It can be anything you want, really. You can choose whatever name you think is appropriate here. And now inside of this, we can actually have our image, and we've already looked at including images. We're also going to include an alt as well. I'm just going to write cat in here. Remember, we already have this cat image in here that we used earlier. So we say img/cat, so that's .png. So the relative URL to this. It can be an absolute URL, by the way. So you could technically take this entire thing here, and this would obviously be HTTP if you were using a website. And you could say website img cat.png, and it would work in exactly the same way. But obviously relative is easier in our case, we're just learning. So we've got an image of a cat. The first thing we want to do is target that image within that profile area. So remember, it's profile and then image. So we're going to do a class selector, and then we're going to do a type selector. You could of course give this image a class if you wanted to. That's absolutely fine. It would probably actually be better. Let's say for some reason we have to use a different element to image. Maybe we used, an anchor, and instead we used a background image to display it, then you would have to change your CSS. Whereas if this had a class, you wouldn't have to. But in my case, I'm relatively sure that image is not going to be substituted for any other element to contain this image. So in here, I'm going to target profile image, like so. So any image within profile, you could of course do a child selector or a direct descendant selector, but we're just going to do profile image. So we're going to use the border radius property. Remember that we have the ability to enter any unit here really. So I'm going to do 50%, which means however big or small the image is, this is always going to be a perfect circle, and it will scale nicely. So we've now got our rounded corners. Now what I'm going to do in this, I'm going to only target WebKit in terms of the filtering and the transitions, but you can go ahead and add vendor prefixes where they're necessary. It may be that by the time you're watching this video, the vendor prefixes aren't required. It depends on when you watch it. But go ahead and check something like can I use and see where you need to use these. And of course you can just play around with them in your browser as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to say WebKit filter. Now what a filter is it allows you to define a specific filter like you would find in Photoshop or Pixelmator, depending on which package you use for editing images. And we can define that as a function. So I can say here grayscale. And I can enter a percentage that I want this to be grayscale. So for example, let's do 10%. That's not going to look very much different, but you can see it's slightly gone a little bit grayscale. Now using the power of our developer tools, we can come in here and we can increase this value. So I'm just hitting the up key. You can see that the higher I get to 100%, this goes to a fully grayscale image. So not only have we included one image, I mean, previously to this, you would have to include 2 images. You wouldn't even be able to do the transition effect that we're going to do. You'd have to have a black and white image. So you'd have to have an image exported that's black and white. And then you would have to have an image that's exported that is in full color. And then you would just have to switch between the two. Or you would have to do this in Flash, which is not a great solution. So the benefit of only including one image is, again, we're only including one HTTP request here, which is great. And we're not swapping over images. We're not going to have any speed issues, pretty much. So we've got a grayscale here. We want this to be grayscale of 100. We only want the color to come in when the user hovers over this. So let's add the standard filter here. So filter grayscale 100%. And let's check this out. There we go. So we've got filter in here is being crossed out because at the moment we can only use the vendor prefix. That's fair enough. We've included it, so we're safe. If you're doing this in any other browser, it might not work. You just have to see how the vendor prefixes are required. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to, on hover, I want to change this back to color. So how can I do this? Well, what we can actually do is we can say profile, or we could do profile hover image. So this is slightly different to what you might have seen before. Remember we were using hover for anchors earlier on in the series. What this basically means is when we hover over the profile, style this image element within it. Now the only reason I'm not going to do it this way is because the profile element you can see has a 100% width because it's a display of block. Remember, blocks span 100% of their parent element. So I'm only going to do the image because you can see that the blue area here is the natural width of the image, 190 by 190. Oh, and by the way, we're also going to give this a width of 190 pixels and a height of 190 pixels. If you were using something like Gravatar, which is an online avatar service, it's pretty popular, you would be able to define in the actual URL to the profile image the actual size. It would be a query string, something like s equals 40, and that would give you back an image of 40 pixels. Therefore, you know it's going to be 40 pixels, so you can style it with 40 pixels, and that would speed up the rendering on the front end. But we can't do that now because we're just using an example image. So I'm going to define the width here anyway, just so the browser doesn't have to calculate that. So, like I said, I'm going to have profile image hover. So any image within a profile element, on hover we want to set additional styles. But what we're going to do is we're going to override what we've already done. So we're going to say WebKit, filter, grayscale. Now we could say 0%, but another thing about CSS is that if you have a 0 unit, for any unit, for percentages, pixels, ems, rems, whatever, you don't have to include the unit because 0 is 0. Whatever a unit is, it doesn't matter what unit you supply. So it's really just a waste of adding an extra character or an extra couple of characters. So we're setting on hover the filter back to 0. So we're defining exactly the same property, exactly the same grayscale function. This is going to overwrite it when we hover. So let's do the normal filter here, just when this is supported, so grayscale 0. So let's check this out. So when I hover over it, let's check this. So to debug this, we can just set the hover here. Okay, so it looks like I have spelt grayscale wrong. So there we go. And that's probably useful. You can, like we've seen before, you can toggle the element state here so you can actually see the styles associated with it. So you don't have to keep going back to your style sheet. So now when I hover over, you can see that it goes from black and white to color. So we've got that effect in there now. Now we're going to look at a new concept that we've not touched on at all, and that's called transitions. And this is a CSS3 property, so it will require the WebKit vendor prefix. And essentially what this is it gives you the ability to transition a certain CSS property. So we take a step back and say, well, we've applied our CSS property here, filter. We are setting the grayscale of it to 100%. And we're doing the same here, but we're resetting it back to 0. But on this initial element, we're going to say, well, when this happens, we want this to smoothly transition. And we can choose the speed and we can choose the transition type. Okay, so the property looks like this. We'll do the normal one first, transition. We take the name of the property, the CSS property that we want to transition. This could be color, could be width, could be height, could be anything. When that particular property changes, we transition on it. And which property are we changing? Well, we're changing filter. So we say filter. So when the filter property changes, we want it to take a certain amount of time. We could say something like 6s for 6 seconds. That would be slightly too long. Or we could say something like 800 milliseconds. And then we say ease. That's just the sort of type of transition. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to add the WebKit version. So WebKit transition, filter, 800 milliseconds, ease. There we go. So just to recap, we've got our normal CSS properties, but in terms of our filter, when this changes from 100 to 0, we have this here to say, well, I want this to, for 800 milliseconds, go from 100 to 0. So let's check this out. Okay, so let's debug this. Let's see, WebKit transition. Of course. So what's happened here is we are doing a transition like this, but what's happened is we are doing a WebKit transition on filter, which isn't actually taking place. So we need to say we want a WebKit transition on WebKit filter, and we need to swap these properties around, because what's happening is the transition is taking precedence over this, which doesn't support this. So technically what you could do is transition WebKit filter, and you could do and leave it like that. Probably not a good idea, but there we go. So now when we hover over, you can see that for 800 milliseconds, that is now changing from 100% to 0 in terms of the grayscale amount. So there we go. We've looked at a few new properties, and we've looked at transitions and filters, which are a really cool new part of CSS3. So you can create things like this just by thinking about how you want things to work. And we've only used one image, so one HTTP request for this image, and we've let CSS do the rest.